Hey guys, welcome back. Okay, so today we're gonna look at a game franchise that has had more identity crisis than a teenager on TikTok, and I'm of course talking about Prince of Persia. Anyways, let's go all the way back to 1989, and you gotta understand what gaming back then was like. Platformers were mostly about fat plumbers jumping on turtles or blue hedgehogs going really fast. Physics were a suggestion, and characters moved with arcade-level snappiness. Enter the OG Prince of Persia for the Apple II, and it fundamentally changed the movement mechanics. It all felt weighty, realistic, and incredibly punishing, and oh man was it punishing. The game gave you exactly 60 minutes to navigate a ridiculously lethal dungeon, defeat the evil dude Jafar, and save the princess, and if you ran out of time, that was it, game over. Also, the dungeon design was straight up sadistic. It was trial and error gameplay at its absolute peak, but cause the animations were so smooth, you couldn't even be mad at it, you know. Anyways, looking back at it today, it's obviously clunky by modern standards, but the atmosphere and the pure innovation make it an undeniable classic. Cause the first game was such a smash hit, it got a sequel in 1993 called The Shadow and the Flame. Taking place almost immediately after the first game, the devs looked at the original and probably thought, what if everything was just way bigger? Okay, so the visual upgrade here was immediately noticeable. You were no longer stuck in visually repetitive dungeons. You were now running across rooftops, exploring grand palaces and delving into deep caverns. But the biggest change was how they handled the combat. The devs realized that getting into one-on-one duels every 5 minutes brought the pacing to a halt, so they cranked up the testosterone and let the prince fight multiple enemies at once. This completely changed the dynamic of the game, making the prince feel less like a desperate rat in a maze and more like an actual action hero. It kept the brutal platforming and the heavy rotoscoped physics, but the increased scale made it a fantastic sequel. It basically took if it ain't broke, don't fix it approach, but slapped a much prettier coat of paint on it. It was the perfect send-off for the 2D era of the franchise. Alright guys, this is where things get ugly. The late 90s were a weird time for video games. Everyone was trying to transition their 2D games into the third dimension, and in 1999, a studio called Red Orb Entertainment decided it was time for the prince to go 3D with Prince of Persia 3D. And holy hell, did they drop the ball, cause this game was essentially a poorly made Tomb Raider clone masquerading as a Prince of Persia game. Also, it had these awful tank controls where you had to slowly rotate him like a semi-truck before moving forward. Now, these kinda worked in games like Resident Evil, but not in a game that demands platforming precision. Also, the game was buggy, the camera would sometimes freak out, and the combat was just bad. And the reviews from back in the day show it getting terrible scores, with almost everyone agreeing that the unresponsive controls and muddy graphics ruined the experience. Anyways, its failure was so spectacularly bad that it practically put the franchise in a coma, and it seemed like the prince was dead and buried. Anyways, fast forward a few years, and Ubisoft swoops in, buys the IP, and gives us the Sands of Time. And this wasn't just a return to form, it was a complete shift for the entire genre. And the absolute genius of Sands of Time boils down to one single mechanic: the dagger of time. So in 3D platformers, the most frustrating thing is missing a jump and instantly dying. But with the dagger, if you fucked up a jump and fell into a pit, you could literally just rewind time. And cause the devs gave you this get out of jail free card, they were free to design some of the most insane, complex and amazing platforming sections the industry had ever seen. But it wasn't just the gameplay that slapped. The narrative presentation was also phenomenal. The whole game is framed as a story the prince is telling in retrospect. You start out as this arrogant, snarky royal dickhead who accidentally unleashes a zombie sand plague, but over the course of the game you actually grow up and mature. Now to be fair, the game wasn't completely flawless. The combat was honestly pretty repetitive and boring. You would fight these sand monsters, and the only way to permanently kill them was to knock them down and stab them with the dagger. But despite the clunky combat, it was a massive hit and remains one of the best games of the PS2 era. Alright, so Ubisoft had a massive hit on their hands. Everyone loved the prince, the atmosphere, and the Persian aesthetics. So what did Ubisoft do for the sequel? They threw all that out the window and released Warrior Within in 2004. Okay, so the gaming industry in 2004 was obsessed with being mature and edgy, so the prince now suddenly had long messy hair, Arabian music replaced by heavy metal guitar riffs, and the combat was suddenly full of slow-mo decapitations and enemies being cut in half. But here's the crazy part. If you look past its presentation, Warrior Within is actually a pretty decent game. The devs knew the combat in Sands of Time kinda sucked, so they overhauled it. Like now you could dual-wield weapons, pick up swords dropped by enemies, and swing around pillars to clear out crowds. The story, while edgy, was actually a pretty cool time travel paradox. And cause you messed with time in the first game, you're being hunted by Dahaka, an unstoppable beast that serves as the guardian of the timeline. It's a game that people love to hate on for its aesthetic, but you can't deny that mechanically it was a massive step up from the last one. Okay, so by 2005, Ubisoft realized that maybe they had pushed the whole edgy thing a bit too far, so they tried to find a middle ground. The result was Two Thrones, and the gimmick this time around was that the timeline had been rewritten again and the vizier from the first game was back. So the prince gets infected with the Sands of Time, which essentially gives him a split personality. Throughout the game, you would randomly transform into the Dark Prince, and you also got this badass chain whip weapon called the Dagger Tail. But the catch was that your health was constantly draining while you were in this form, so you had to play incredibly aggressively to collect sand from enemies and pots just to stay alive. Furthermore, they also added a stealth system called speed kills. So like instead of just running into a room and fighting 10 guys, you could use your platforming skills to sneak above them and trigger a quick time event to assassinate them silently. It was super satisfying and helped break up the action. Now, was it perfect? No. For some bizarre reason, they added these incredibly frustrating chariot racing sections that controlled like absolute garbage. And while the dialogue tried to recapture the charm of the first game, it sometimes felt a bit forced. But overall, it was a fantastic conclusion to the Sands of Time trilogy. Okay, so after this incredibly successful trilogy of 3D action games, what do you do next? If you said, make a turn-based tactical card game, then congratulations, you're a Ubisoft executive from 2005. Battles of Prince of Persia dropped on the DS, and it is, without a doubt, the weirdest entry in the entire franchise. It was set in the gap between Sands of Time and Warrior Within, basically explaining exactly how the Dahaka started hunting the prince and how he ended up becoming so bitter and angry. The gameplay is wild. Like every turn, or hour as the game calls it, you draw cards that can be used in two ways. You can either use the number on the card to issue commands, or you can use the magic effect on the card to buff your guys. Honestly, mechanically the game is actually pretty deep and satisfying for strategy nerds. But man, the presentation is rough. The story is told through these super generic text-heavy comic book panels, and when your units fight, you get these primitive little animations on the top screen that completely fail to capture the energy of a Prince of Persia game. It's an incredibly weird anomaly of a game that most people completely ignored.
Here is the box. It comes at the price of 100 men's lives.
By 2008, the Sands of Time story was done, so Ubisoft decided it was time for a fresh start, and the new game was simply called Prince of Persia. It's arguably the most divisive title in the entire franchise, and looking back on it, you can totally see why. First off, visually, they went with this cel-shaded, vibrant art style, and like the whole premise is that you play as a completely new character, a grave robber who just happens to be called the Prince, and you team up with a magical princess named Elika to fight Ahriman, the god of darkness. Your goal is to run around this open-ended world and heal the corrupted environments. But the gameplay? Oh boy. Ubisoft made a highly controversial design choice. They essentially removed the ability to die. Like if you miss a jump and fall down a pit, Elika instantly teleports to you and throws you back to the last solid platform. And if you're about to lose a sword fight, Elika steps in and saves you. From a technical standpoint, this is kinda similar to the rewind mechanic from Sands of Time. But honestly, the lack of a death screen removed all the stakes and tension from the platforming, making it feel like the game was just playing itself on autopilot. Then to top it all off, the game ends on a massive cliffhanger where the prince basically undoes all your hard work just to save Elika's life. I still think it's worth playing just for the art style, but it's definitely not for everyone. Okay, so to accompany the big console reboot, Ubisoft also made a Nintendo DS game called The Fallen King, and it actually continues the story of the 2008 reboot, having the prince team up with a new magic guy named Zal to cleanse a city of corruption. And if you thought the main game was divisive, get a load of this. The entire game is controlled with the DS stylus. You tap the screen to run, you swipe to jump, and you furiously swipe the screen to fight enemies. Now, when stylus controls work, they can be kinda neat in a gimmicky way, but when they don't, which is most of the time, it's infuriating. So the game is known for having incredibly buggy touch controls, which is the exact opposite of what you want in a platformer. It was also short, repetitive, and honestly, you can completely skip this one unless you're a hardcore fan or something. Alright, welcome to 2010. And instead of just making one game and porting it, Ubisoft tasked different studios with making entirely different games, all with the exact same title, The Forgotten Sands. Okay, so let's start with the HD version for the PS3, Xbox 360, and PC. This was supposed to be the main game, covering the gap between Sands of Time and Warrior Within. So, the prince goes to visit his brother Malik's kingdom, finds it under attack, and Malik ends up unleashing a mythological sand army led by a fiery djinn named Ratash. You then spend the rest of the game trying to put the genie back in the bottle with the help of a water djinn named Razia. And the main selling point here was the scale. Like the engine could now throw up to 50 enemies on screen at once, turning the combat into a very basic crowd control hack and slash. The combat was just okay at best, but the platforming was actually pretty good. However, the game had massive issues, like it was painfully linear, and the camera was strictly locked, refusing to let you look around and explore. The story was also super weak and failed to explain how the prince turned into the angry emo kid from Warrior Within. It just felt like a rushed, safe, and an ultimately forgettable cash grab.
I've never seen a storm like.
Now, here's the plot twist. While the main HD game was incredibly mid, the Nintendo Wii version of Forgotten Sands was actually a completely different game, and it was significantly better. Like, I'm not even kidding, it has a completely different story. The prince meets a sassy genie named Zara, and you go to this mystical kingdom to fight off a corrupted plant entity. It used the engine from the original PS2 trilogy, so the platforming felt incredibly tight, and the motion controls for combat were actually well implemented. Also, the pacing was better, the environments were more organic, and it honestly felt like a true successor to Sands of Time. Anyways, just to make things as confusing as possible, Ubisoft also released two more completely different games under the Forgotten Sands name. The PSP version was a side-scrolling platformer where the prince gets kidnapped by a cult in India, gets his memory erased, and has to team up with a sword spirit to stop a ritual. It was fine, a decent little handheld distraction, but nothing to write home about. Then there's the DS version, which was basically a sequel to The Fallen King, and just like it, tapping the screen to fight and jump got really old, really fast. It's universally agreed upon to be the worst version of the bunch. Honestly, releasing 4 different games with the exact same name and box art is just peak 2010 Ubisoft logic, and it completely diluted the brand. Okay, so after Forgotten Sands, the prince went into hibernation for like 14 years. Cause like Ubisoft was too busy making billions of dollars turning Assassin's Creed into these massive bloated RPGs. But then, in 2024, they released The Lost Crown. So like they realized that trying to compete in the 3D space was pointless, so they took the series back to its 2D roots and turned it into a Metroidvania. So you don't play as the prince, you play as Sargon, who's part of a warrior group called the Immortals, and you're sent to the time-cursed Mount Croft to rescue the kidnapped Prince Ghassan. And when I say the controls in this game are tight, I mean they're razor sharp. The platforming sections are brutal, taking inspiration from games like Hollow Knight and Metroid Dread. The combat is equally phenomenal. It's not just mashing an attack button, you have directional strikes, parries, juggles, and special meter attacks. Now, it isn't perfect. Like, the story is honestly mid as hell, the dialogue can be a bit generic, and some of the levels feel a little too linear. And a few questlines abruptly end or feel unfinished due to bugs or budget cuts, but overall, it's a great game. And there you have it, guys, every single Prince of Persia game explained. It's a franchise that refuses to stay in one lane. Okay, so let me know in the comments which game is your favorite, and as always, I'll see you guys in the next one.